We have a great panel. Next to me on my left is Congressman Ted Yoho from Florida. Now he'll explain to you what he's working on these days, but he is a fine friend with shared faith and shared values, and we had a lot of fun up in the swamp together, and we still have fun because he's a great guy. Next to him on my left is Leah Peterson. She's also an expert in the field with the OPIC and the DFC, and she'll lend her wisdom on those matters. She's a connector in D.C. She worked for USAID. She's worked for a bunch of the institutions that make things work and help people connect. And then at the very end, we have John Hoteling, a very successful attorney from New Orleans. And he is notable for many reasons, one of which is he helped negotiate the biggest deal with China under President Trump. So try squaring that one. He'll tell you what all that looks like. But if you need help structuring huge deals or projects, you want to contact him and get in touch with him, and he will share how to do that. And so first, I'm going to turn the floor over to Congressman Ted Yoho. And Ted, why don't you explain the legislation you authored and passed, which is huge in itself, the BUILD Act, and then the implications for today, and then how folks interact with that today, and,
Sure.
and how to contact you to help.
I'd be glad to, Dave, and I appreciate it, Leah. Tim, good to see you here. It's an honor to be here, and David, I appreciate what you have put together and brought together here, equity in Africa. I think that's so important that we concentrate on that. You know, Africa's population is going to double, they anticipate, by 2050, and we have to make sure that the proper things are in place so that they can be self-sustaining. And when I came into Congress, one of the things I wanted to do was focus on foreign aid. It's a well-known secret that I wanted to get rid of foreign aid. But after I came up to Congress, you know, I went through a fast learning curve that you cannot remove foreign aid. But what we can do is we can do it better. And so we looked at the different structures out there. OPIC was a great model because it had returned money to the American taxpayers 39 out of 40 years. And in 2016, it was appropriated $69 million, but returned to the U.S. Treasury's $265 million. So what we did, that was started in 1974, and it hadn't really been updated. So it'd be like driving a 1974 car today, and you can see how outdated that is. And so what we did is we got rid of OPIC, and we put in what we called the BUILD Act, which was authorization to create the United States International Development Finance Corporation. So that removed OPIC, replaced it with what we commonly refer to as the DFC, and the improvements that we have made were many. One of the biggest ones is OPIC was limited to $29 billion in lending capacity. We raised that to $60 billion. But in addition to that, we'd allowed the American government to take an equity stake in a project and bring in private equity. And I'll explain the equity stake that the government takes. So instead of giving money to build a road, say $1 million, and maybe that road doesn't get finished for whatever reason, the United States government winds up, that's just a grant and it gets written off, and we get no return on that. What with the DFC, with that equity stake, the United States partners up, not just with that country, but they partner up with the equity stakeholders. And then when the project is up and running, they sell that equity stake so that they don't want to own that. They just want to help make sure and ensure that the investment gets put into place, that the right things are done, and that we can move ourselves out of it. And our whole motto as we did this was to help countries move from aid to trade. And the way we saw the best way to do that was to do strong infrastructure investments for the benefit of that country, not for the benefit of the United States. Our benefit is this: if we can help a country become self-sustaining and move from aid to trade, they develop an economic engine because the infrastructures are put in there that will invite more private equity, that will create the economic base for job development and things like that. The other thing that the BUILD Act did is we can lend in the currency of a country, so you don't have to go through the exchange rate. Countries can make payments in that. There's risk insurance in there, risk mitigation insurance. There's the funding to go into a project to do your studies, to make the project feasible. And so these were big things that we could do that we couldn't do before. It's that the BUILD Act authorized the DFC to do. The other thing is, before, through OPIC, we couldn't really partner with other countries that had development finance corporations. With the DFC, we can now partner with any country like Canada, Japan, the UK, Australia, any country that has a development finance corporation. So we can leverage that money we have, that $60 billion, and you can put up to 20% of that in any one project. We can leverage that, and that $60 billion becomes hundreds of billions of dollars if it's done right. And so that, pretty much in a nutshell, is what the BUILD Act did to create the Development Finance Corporation.
Great. And Ted, why don't you finish up that logic? So folks want to access that. Do you need to pay consultants? How do people access that? It sounds like a pretty complex thing you're going to have to navigate. What are the first steps that the African leaders can take, or the African business folks that are here that want to partner in that?
That's a great question, because a lot of people ask us that. And probably the best thing to do is, if you can come and contact the people at DFC, they've got a website, but arrange a meeting with them. And of course, today we're in a new world with COVID. Everybody's doing meetings and getting used to them via Zoom or other platforms. Arrange a meeting, but kind of have real succinct the kind of project you want. Because so many times people say, yeah, we need investment in our country. Great. What do you need to do? Well, we want to create jobs. Well, what kind of jobs? And they haven't thought through that. If you know you're short of power, and in Africa, it's a continent of, I think, 1.2 billion people, and 650 million people don't have electricity. Infrastructure in the electrical systems and grids are something that really needs to be invested in. And so if you're a country that you're having challenges with electricity, getting it out, there are so many different projects that the DFC can partner up with and bring in industry. They can bring in the expertise of the engineers, the people that do the background studies. So if you know specifically what project you want, you're further ahead. And then I would arrange a meeting with Miss Sanjari, who is one of the assistant directors of the DFC, and also David Marchant, who is the new CEO and president. They are very open to discussions. And, I've had people contact them. They've had great rapport with them. And if you have a lobbyist, I think it would probably help you navigate that. If you can set up a meeting personally or via one of the electronic platforms, do that. And have a specific project that you lay out, because it'll go that much quicker. And what it would entail on your end, if you want to put in a hydroelectric dam or an electric grid somewhere, or a highway, have the partners in your country or contractors that you're thinking about, have them vetted already, so that when this happens, you can move forward that much quicker.
Great. And Ted, we're going to have breakout sessions in the next hour. Some high-powered folks in D.C. are going to be helping you. Porter Delaney and Rob Mossbacher. You want to just do 30 seconds on each and tell them who's helping them?
I can't say enough about both of those guys, because Rob Mossbacher, he was the CEO of OPIC, and he was very instrumental in helping getting that legislation passed. And Porter Delaney of the Kyle House Group, that bill would not have passed without the effort of his team and Rob pushing and lobbying members of Congress. And then it was somebody like me that they helped re-educate, that I could go to my conservative friends, which I'm very conservative, in Congress, and to educate them on moving countries from aid to trade. And if we don't reform foreign aid, we're going to fall behind, because the world is changing. In fact, they say there's a tectonic shift in world powers we haven't seen since World War II. And one of the rising powers, obviously, is China, and they have the Belt Road Initiative. And so this bill was one of those things that was to counter that. And Rob Mossbacher and Porter Delaney, again, were instrumental in getting this bill passed.
All right. Is he about the most likable guy you've ever seen? You see why he got elected to Congress a bunch of times? It's the way. It's always the wife's the successful part, right? Well, I just want to thank you, Ted. Ted and I are going to go out in case you need to meet with. He's very busy, but if you want to meet Ted out in the hall in the networking area, I'm going to bring him out quick, and then we're going to transition and to Leah Peterson, who is one of the most capable people on these issues you've ever met. We met at the Bible Museum just by chance after we had already run into each other on these set of issues. And she's a person of faith like Ted is. And just by the way, Ted, in passing, is very humble. We had a China summit last year, and he said, "Can I come and talk a little bit?" And I said, "Yeah, you come." I said, "Love to have you." He knocks it out of the park, and rave reviews from half of Asia the next day. And so Ted's very humble. We'll be out in the hallway if you want to meet Ted and catch up and connect with him, and he can help point you in the right directions. But I'm going to turn over the panel right now to Leah Peterson. And please give Ted Yoho a warm round of applause and appreciation. And Leah Peterson a hand as we transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Dave, of course, for everything. Appreciate it. So what I would like to do is pick off some of the conversation pieces that were just brought forward. And I think a big part of what we're struggling with here, and really opportunity lies in the struggle, is how do we take the instruments and opportunities and structures that are available to all of you, but somehow begin to implement them? So we are at a point in development where institutions like Development Finance Corporation are operating at greater levels of efficiency thanks to the leadership of Congressman Yoho, but we're also at a point where development capital and development finance institutions can only do so much. And so what I mean by that is for the developing world as a whole, to reach some of the economic development goals by 2030, there's about a $4.5 trillion financing gap, pretty sizable. And with development finance institutions and donors stepping up alone, we're still facing a gap of about $2.5 trillion to really help these economies get to the next level. So what does that mean for us in the room? There's an implicit expectation that the private sector will step in to fill that gap. And now our DFC organization is under much more flexibility in its ability to do so. And I'll just briefly step back to tell you a little bit about my background. I was working and serving the Trump administration for the past almost 3 years as the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. In addition, I was actually a senior advisor to the Women's Economic Empowerment initiatives with the White House, and had the opportunity to lead a number of what are called blended finance transactions, where we, as the U.S. government, could use capital, grant capital from USAID, mix it more or less with what is called senior debt capital from a DFC, along with private sector capital to implement blended finance funds or blended finance structures. These blended finance funds or structures are seen as probably the key instrument in order to unlock the capital gaps that we have at present, i.e. the $2.5 trillion capital gap, more or less. So the structure's there. Since 2000, there have been a number of blended finance transactions sponsored by large commercial banks, but in total, they've raised about, or mobilized capital of about $150 billion. That's still a drop in the bucket. However, the structures are there and they're getting larger every day. So that's one of the pieces of advice I would really think about as a leader in Africa, an economic and finance leader. The second is, within USAID, we focused on something called the journey to self-reliance. Similar to the points just mentioned, the goal wasn't necessarily to use aid and donations for the purposes of lifting folks out of poverty, although that's a very noble goal. Our goal at USAID under the Trump administration was to help move countries from being a donor or donor recipient to a donor provider, and that would be their journey to self-reliance. And so part of that journey to self-reliance, and a key part of it, is the mobilization of private capital and private sector. So the funds that I structured in particular really focused a lot on women's economic empowerment. There's about a $300 billion gap in financing for women at this point in time. These are really well-run companies that are bankable. The key word is bankable. Anything you bring to the DFC needs to be bankable. You also, as Tim mentioned, you need to bring a structure in place. You have partners. With the DFC structure, now there's a greater number of partners that can be crowded into some of these opportunities. And so within USAID, we had to put our thinking caps on. We had to say, we're working with taxpayer money here. That's important. To me, every day, that was important. How can I make every dollar go further? And one of the most important aspects was using that dollar to crowd in private capital. So within these structures, and I will not get too technical, feel free to pull me aside, there's something called sort of a risk capital reserve. And I'm sure John will go into greater detail about that. But it's a critical feature of these funds, because why isn't capital moving into these markets? Folks say perceived risk, well, perhaps actual risk. And then secondly, the models. The models need to support some kind of risk ratio return and provide downside protection for investors. So unless funds or activities or models are actually providing that level of protection, it may be very challenging to engage on the level that we want to in this room. However, the structures are there, and I was very pleased to recently read one in particular where a venture capital firm launched a Tech for Impact fund. Normally, that's sort of grant capital that provides the backstop to ensure that there's less downside risk for investors. African leaders actually stepped up to provide that. And that's a really important takeaway, because I think we're at a point in time where if you build this structure, they will come. Different parts of the capital stack will come to fulfill the needs that are required of your countries, and also the opportunities that require additional capital. But unless we take time to figure out those structures, we may be left with what we described within USAID is the inability or the lack of a clear choice. Clear choice was something that we developed around opaque types of financing, meaning if China's the only player that's coming to the table, what's built into their debt covenants that could actually, at a later point in time, allow them to take control of the assets they're actually investing in. And Secretary Pompeo laid out this agenda last night. But oftentimes, I thought to myself, these are the expectations of the US government, but we're not always stepping up and providing the solutions in terms of how to close that financing gap. So as we step away from this conversation, I think we want to realize Africa's poised, it's ready, it's resilient. Now we need to lean on the various financing structures so that when debt comes to the table and it's from America, they know where to plug in. When mezzanine comes, when donors come, they know where to plug in. So there's a number of blended finance fund structures that are out there that are good models. And before I transition to John, just will speak to one of those, and it was for a private equity firm built into Women's World Banking. Women's World Banking is a 40-year-old organization that's been providing microloans to women for decades. Why are they in private equity? Well, they also realize that financial institutions in parts of Africa, for example, aren't lending to women. So it really negates their entire model. So they decided to start a private equity fund that would raise institutional capital that would invest in banks that were actually making it easier to lend to women, more accessible, perhaps even creating the technologies to get to women who couldn't necessarily enter a bank themselves. So we partnered with Women's World Banking to provide capital in that first loss, which then subsequently brought in almost $100 million of investor capital, private sector capital, to fund this fund. Now, it may seem, again, like a drop in the bucket, but we can do these structures, but just add another zero. So, but again, focusing on the need for protecting that downside investment providing the downside protection is critical, but also understanding the needs of the investors who are coming to these markets. So I'll stop there, and I would actually love to have introduce John. So as was mentioned earlier by Dave, John has put together a sizable transaction with China. Now, I know China seems to be somewhat of a bad word occasionally, but in chatting with John, I was really impressed about his approach and thoughtfulness to how some of these models might actually be expanded to Africa, and specifically the notion that a relationship between the US and Africa may have some more advantages to us than a relationship between the US and China. So I'll allow for him to explain that a bit more, and then I think really provide some tangible takeaways in terms of the importance of structuring deals the right way.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you everybody, and thank you Liberty University for putting this together, and all the African leaders that have traveled here under such difficult circumstances. This is really, I was glad to speak here. We have a couple projects, American Ethane, that are in development in Africa. But I was very glad to speak to this, because I think if we step back and we look at the larger picture of Africa, there's not a single place on the planet, there's not a single continent that has more development capacity than Africa on Earth. There's reasons why in developing countries, though, we have to look at it and see, why is it not? What's the reason? You know, we can go back historically, the reasons have changed. I mean, there was points of time where Ghana was the most, the richest, was 5 times the size of London, that it was a capital of the world. It's no longer, but there's so much potential that are here in Africa, and how do we draw that out in emerging countries? So I've been, as my background, yes, I'm a lawyer, but I've transitioned, and I wear different hats as also a joint venture, and we've done large infrastructure projects in emerging countries. We did the first IPP in Central America that I was involved in. I started doing these projects as a lawyer and trying to figure out how the projects, I usually represented the joint venture, the guy with the idea, the person that would find a market in a different place and say, okay, I want to be a first mover. And they would meet the person with money, they would figure it out, and if the project was successful, generally the little guy got pushed out. So in that type of representation, though, you start to understand what makes projects stick, what makes them happen. We all know that there's the potential out there. Look at the amount of people that are there, the creativity and the intelligence that can be there. How do we draw that out? From a US government standpoint, I can tell you it's also very important. The Congressman has talked about this. Relationships with emerging markets. The United States, obviously, it spends so much money of our budget in those relationships. Why? National security. Prosperity and national security are tied together. If we have long-term prosperity relationships between each other, countries get closer. You look at the countries around the world where we're close in this. And what's also interesting, you know, as the Congressman has pointed out, the United States government is starting to get involved in these relationships from a business standpoint. One of the things that helped American Ethane very early on was the US Commerce Department. They actually have an advocacy program for companies in emerging markets. Many people don't know this. But if the United States government can take a project and find this is a very significant project and development in another country, and they can actually help, if they like it and they vet it, they can be your advocate in that country to help navigate the waters, the political waters and whatnot in the different countries, and start making connections and explain to the other government that this long-term relationship between business is important. It's a win-win. And the United States government, so the advocacy, one of the reasons that our project became so successful was the United States advocacy program looked at American Ethane. And the amount of, you know, it was born out of, we founded American Ethane out of the shale revolution. As most people know, at this point, the United States is the largest gas producer in the world. Connecting other countries to our gas supply is very important. Gas supply, of course, the price of energy. This is one of the key components in emerging markets. You know, we go around emerging markets all over the world, and that's one of the pieces. There's little pieces of the puzzle that you need to put together major projects. And cost of energy is right up there at the top of it. If you have a high cost of energy, you can't have manufacturing. You can't have grids. You don't have an electrical grid. You don't have this, and this stops. In a lot of places that are fantastic to be able to do manufacturing, this stops it because of it. Now, the United States is looking at that right now. Companies like ours that are liquefying gas and transitioning it to energy or to manufacturing is key, and the US government is recognizing that. But what the problem with that in the development is it's not a one-time deal. Pulling deals off that are major infrastructure projects, they take a lot of money. Right now, American Ethane and its partners, we have $72 billion worth of contracts pending with China right now. It requires a $28 billion investment. We're building our terminal, we have to build ships to liquefy gas, and we've got to invest in and build terminals on other parts of the countries. And one thing we're looking at is investment into Africa, of building terminals in Africa. Now, entrepreneurs can find an arbitrage, can find a deal, they can find opportunities, and that's the first spark that you need. The entrepreneurial idea to make connections like we have in this room, to find a way to do business, the needs of Africa, the needs of the United States. But then how do you pull it off? You can have a really good idea, but then you have to execute. And one of the things you do when you execute, you need money, you need investment. And when you're investing from country to country, there's generally, especially when you're considering energy, these are the biggest projects, the most impactful projects. If we do an energy project with China, which is what we've done, we tie up resources for 20 years. The infrastructure, the $28 billion that we're investing, we don't get it back in year one. It takes 20 years to be able to do it. And so if you're investing in Africa and you're investing in stuff, you're building big infrastructure, which ties our countries together in both prosperity and security. We're both dependent upon that stuff. How do you build that? How do you have an investment in an emerging market? Well, a lot of people will look at it and say, well, the political climate. I'm worried about the political climate. I'm worried about the political risk in the various countries. For entrepreneurs, that's really not the biggest thing, I have to tell you. And for those of us that are looking at doing multi-billion-dollar investments in countries, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is if you have an investor, first you find an arbitrage, first you find a deal. You make the investment, you look at it, you can engineer. In our case, we're engineering terminals and boats. In our case, we're taking ethane. The United States, most people don't know what ethane is, but ethane is a very rare gas in the world. Just so happens the United States has the largest amount of ethane on Earth because of our geology. Okay, we have the most of it. China needs it. China needs it to make plastic. You can also make energy out of it very inexpensively through power plants. So it's energy and manufacturing. It's kind of a golden substance. But you got to liquefy it, and then you got to ship it. And that infrastructure is expensive. So there's a huge arbitrage between the United States and Africa, huge arbitrage between us and China with this product. We know we can make a lot of money. We know it can be a win-win for the people in manufacturing in those countries. We know it can be a win for us. But how do we make the decision of investing tens of billions of dollars in ships and terminals? And how do we know? Because why? It's no different in an emerging market that is in the United States, doing a business. What if somebody doesn't pay me? What if I make the investment and it's all good, and then they breach the contract? There isn't a person in Africa or China that is different than an investor in the United States. No different. Everybody wants to make an investment. They want to make a profit. There's no difference. And there's no difference between Africa. If you look at it, and take other countries. Take other countries in Asia. Take China is a good example. What's the difference between China and Singapore? Singapore is going like a rocket in investment and the rest of it. And China, for oil and gas companies, for big infrastructure companies, it's been a no-no. We were a company, a startup company, big, that leaped in front of the giants in China. You know, we were the number one. I mean, I sat there with all the big companies in gas companies on Earth, me from New Orleans, signing the biggest deal with President Trump on one side and President Xi on the other, and all the television cameras. How does that happen? It's because they overlook it. And they look at it and they say, you know what, in China, I make my big investment. What if they breach the contract? Where am I going to go? Where am I going to get it? A lot of it comes down, it's not because I'm a lawyer, but it comes down to it, the legal system. If they breach the contract, how am I going to get my money back? Now, in the United States, you've got a very stable legal system. We have a lot of problems in the United States, but one thing we have really good is we've got a really good judiciary. We've got a really uncorruptible judiciary. It's very rare that you see corruption associated with the judiciary in the United States. You see corruption in other parts of it, but not there. And same thing with England, same thing with Singapore, same thing in those places. These places are thriving because investors know I can invest money, they breach the contract, we can bring them into court, and we can collect. Now, how do you do that in an emerging market? Take China, for example. Why did we go to China first? We didn't necessarily go to China first, I gotta tell you. We went to a lot of places, we went to China last. Even though we knew that there was other places, we went to China. Well, we know there's a big market, but there's a big market a lot of places, in a lot of emerging markets that are the same. The arbitrage for gas, making plastics from ethane, is huge right now. Gigantic of making plastic from ethane. Okay, it's clean, it's a way of doing it. But why do we go there? We went there first, okay? A lot of companies didn't go to China. And they didn't go to China first because the same problem that is in other emerging markets. What happened if they breach? In a communist country, it's pretty hard to have a judiciary that's independent. That's one of the main reasons why communism is not working as well as capitalism, is because if you control the government, you control the courts. If the courts aren't independent, you have a problem. One of the reasons why Africa should be doing business with the United States versus China is for that reason. That when you have a partner and you have a venue where you can collect and you can structure a deal to protect my investment. It's all about protecting your investment. That if they breach, how do I get my money back? Now, one of the deals, we had deals, and one of the reasons we were able to structure this large deal, okay, was that we figured a way, there's ways of changing the venue of contracts. This is really important. People know that. I can have a deal with an emerging market, and I can say I'll invest the money, and then if there's a breach, we fight in Singapore, we fight in the UK, we fight in the United States. But everybody knows that. But what happens about collecting? Where's the asset? You can have a judgment against somebody who isn't going to pay you or that's got a wall between China. How are you going to do it? How are you going to collect inside? And so one of the ways we structured it in American Ethane is now being copied by some of the large giant companies, is the fact that we looked at a big arbitrage and we made the other people partners in our deal here. We invested there and they invested in us. So that we then had an asset here if there was a difference. You have to come up with creative solutions because that's part of it, is that if there's a breach. And that's what's slowing them. Two things are slowing emerging markets down. The cost of energy and collectability. Collectability if the deal goes bad. What's not stopping it is the potential prosperity or the potential of the deals. There is hundreds of billions of dollars wanting to be invested in Africa right now. I can tell you our company alone is looking at wanting to invest billions of dollars in places in Africa. But we have to figure out that part of the piece. And one of the things that gets involved is it's good to have the countries, it's good to have the United States Commerce Department and to be able to have the leaders in Africa up there because they can provide certain guarantees. Okay, they can be able to provide certain avenues of collection. One of the things that we did in our deal in China is we made force majeure. Force majeure is when somebody can just break a contract, something, an act of God or something else to break a contract. One of the almost always clauses in contracts is that if the country gets involved and stops the deal, or changes the law, that's force majeure. So if China pulls our permit the next day after we build our terminal and spend billions of dollars in a certain place, the deal's off, we're out. When many markets, and this has happened in China, it's happened in other places, the local business people get with the government and they change a law and it's out. and all that investment goes away. What that teaches an investor like us, dangerous. But one thing we did is we said, look, we're going to take that force majeure part. If your government changes it, it's on you. I keep the asset over here. If ours keeps it, we don't make that a force majeure. That's the same as if you breach the contract. And then we had assets that were placed in both places. And that was that we were able to structure the deal that way. So there's little tricks in everything, but one of the takeaways is there's a tremendous amount of opportunity out there. There's a tremendous amount of money, and that money, a lot of it's in huge infrastructure that can last for a very, very long time. But it's not enough to say, I've got an idea. I've got a business. Because you can start in the development money. The development money, we spent, on development over, we're well over $100 million before we started just developing the idea in different places, flying all over the world and getting engineers and getting involved in that kind of stuff. The development part's very, so on the front end of it, you have to be able to have the structure of, if the deal goes bad and they stop paying, how do I collect? It's number one, so.
So thank you, John. I appreciate that. So no insignificant, it's not an insignificant request, right? So I think that always the question is the how at that point. And as John talked through, there are government institutions within the United States that will provide those guarantees. So that's a key thing that I want everyone to take away. Not necessarily the fact that we can provide those guarantees, but that we acknowledge that the risks exist, and we acknowledge that unless we, as the US government, are really putting our guarantees where our mouth is in terms of encouraging US investment to come to your countries, we're really doing you a disservice. This is just another conversation. And we want to move beyond just another conversation. So you're speaking with two people who have had to do this in country, John on a very significant scale, myself on a more micro scale, being innovative in terms of who's coming to the table to address those risks. But I do want to call out a Liberty University business school student I was chatting with, and when just quickly discussing the topic that we're dealing with him, I won't embarrass him by pointing, he just really quickly noted that, well, these markets, perhaps they're too risky, so the return needs to be higher, but perhaps more or less that the perception of risk may or may not be there. So hitting the nail on the head, essentially, saying, is this real risk, is it not? And then with time and these transactions and usage of guarantees, we can prove out that the risks are there or they're not, or how we address those over time. But risk management is a key part of what any organization is looking for as they invest. And whether it's John having to go back to his CFO because the risk-reward ratio, more or less, of investing in a country isn't really working out in their favor, or in my case, working with funds that don't want to invest in new markets unless they have that cushion that's necessary, that should something go wrong, whether it's force majeure or perhaps there's just dealing with some levels of activity at the country level, it's really reassuring for investors to always know that they have that cushion and they can manage their portfolios. So that portfolio management piece, using risk management, is a key part of the conversation. I want every business leader from Africa to walk away knowing that the desire is there and the tools are there. I would have that conversation about risk much sooner, because you get to the heart of the challenge much sooner. And I will just say briefly that I kicked off some of the initial structured finance solutions that led to what's called blended finance today. And that was in the global health arena. And one of the major issues to actually address malaria in Africa countries is that nets weren't arriving on time, and they were arriving after the rainy season. And what I did is I structured a payment guarantee so that CFOs of bed net manufacturers had some level of cushion should grant financing not come through on time or in full. But they were able to start procurement, start production faster. And with that, with just a couple transactions, we certainly averted close to 1 million cases of malaria and probably close to 500 100,000 lives saved. But that was a very, very early stage. So those that feel free to have that discussion and also engage in the financial creativity. This is meant to be a creative discussion. And with that, I think, John, you had another point.
Yeah,
perhaps.
no, I think I was going to double down on what you said is the fact that you need to have the breach of contract conversation first. Because what happens if one of the parties doesn't live up to the agreement? That's the foundation. That's the foundation of business. Okay, is being able to collect. It's the mortgage. You know, getting money is entirely dependent. The first thing is what happens if somebody doesn't pay. When you put your house up for a mortgage, the bank knows it can take the house. Okay, that's the first foundation of it, and that's what's stopping business. That's what's stopping. Now, we were very hard-headed to try to get to a solution of that, but that's what stops getting into the C-suites with major companies. First, is they go, no way to collect if they breach. No way to collect. So if you can solve that problem first, it's not a lack of funds. It's not a lack of opportunities or investments or any of that stuff. It's that first. So you solve that, and you solve that one way in one business, it applies to all kinds of businesses. So even outside of your sector, if you start solving that problem, then a whole host of opportunities start opening up. And those that crack an emerging market, you know, the returns and stuff, there's lots of money that are built up in the United States and in Europe and in investors in other places that are trying to unlock it. You know, in my case, I've got European investors who are used to and comfortable with emerging markets. They just want to know there's a collection for breach, and they got bunches of money to be able to do it with. But they want emerging market returns. There's people that want the returns that come with not just the risk, because the risk depending on if the contract's breached, but the scalability. The scalability of something working in Africa is tremendously big, and that is something that really lights the brain of lots of entrepreneurs and investors. But what stops it first, and that's why I think you're right to say that needs to be the first conversation. But there's a lot of opportunities that are coming that are just on the horizon. You know, one of the things that has been talked about, and I've talked about, it's one of the investment things that we're doing outside of American Ethane, but on communication and telecommunication in Africa. It's the thing that it's stopping. It's difficult, and it's the grids, and it's the expense of the grids and the infrastructure. It's going back to how do you do expensive electricity and the infrastructure necessary for it? But there's new technologies that are right now on the horizon. You know, with solar panels and battery, there's CATOT, there's battery technology that is right on the cusp. That's coming very, very soon. That's going to be able to make it so that you can have routers and you can have really good battery technology and freestanding stuff, and that'll start lighting different pockets of Africa, and that will start doing it. There's lots of stuff that's coming around on the horizon, and so. I don't think that there's anything that we can do on, in terms of, taking it from a Christian perspective back to a Christian perspective. I don't think that there's anything we could do better, for more amount of people than to have connectivity to the potential prosperity for people in Africa. It is just something that we can do that's just fantastic for the world and our fellow humans. So we're very happy to be part of the discussion.
And to add to that, just another thought is this is all very nuanced and complex. And one thing that I think is important to take back, because we're being encouraged to talk to our government leaders, is you all are engaging your Minister of Finance. But again, engage them in a way that they know exactly what to do. Whether it's John's advice or what I'm suggesting in terms of creating financial structures that are attractive to investors, and doing it also at a time when it's a new administration. So, but the Minister of Finance is a critical part of this dynamic. And I remember having worked in Africa a lot, even though in the global health space, I was invited quite frequently to the Minister of Finance's office because they were curious about how to apply payment guarantees to solve commodity issues, to solve the fact that product wasn't flowing fast enough to these markets. And so you have the capability now to say, we have reliable and tested structures to cover risk. Maybe it's through an ADB, African Development Bank guarantee. Maybe that's a new guarantee for an ADB or a DFC. Well, then we need to put together a collateral fund to backstop that guarantee for a temporary period of time, because that's a new product for ADB. But that backstop or that guarantee is required to crowd in capital for early stage innovations. The future of Africa's economy is growing for a variety of reasons, but one is the diaspora too. Either folks that are coming back and choose, or those who are staying. And when they make those decisions, and there's many of you in the room, you're bringing phenomenal ideas with you, and you're bringing incredible business plans. So either you need financing for acquisition, for recapitalization, for growing and scaling your company. But either way, that capacity needs to be unlocked through instruments that cover these risks. And that's a conversation piece. I would encourage all of you to come together, look at the various models, study them, and have a conversation with your Minister of Finance and say, how do we release this and test it in a way that can help catalyze X amount of capital into Y industry, but be very specific and either work with John or me or somebody, but we are happy to have that conversation. Having you all here too is the first step, okay? I think it's a really important step because we're all coming out of the COVID pandemic, and I think that Africa will be very resilient. So expect that investors will be stepping up to want to invest in Africa. So take a little bit of a mind shift. You're not there to just accept whatever comes your way. You're there to accept what comes your way under the best terms possible, but also be prepared with the right structure so that you're covering the risk, so that when there's this window of opportunity, and Africa is frankly maybe doing better than the rest of the world economically, that you're covering these risks so that it is attractive investment, remains attractive investment, and the capital flows come through and can be utilized to scale up business and industry.
I think we have a couple minutes. Maybe if we have, can we take any questions and stuff from the audience? Is there anyone that has any sort of questions we can discuss?
Anything? Well, it's a good sign not everyone's, go.
I should have thought about this with a microphone, but hey.
You can come sit.
Thank you. Mine is a contribution. I appreciate your concern when you're talking about the independence of the judiciary in African nation. That's very, very important. But you also realize that this independence is mostly political, because the government wants to have a control and decide who takes over political position. It's not necessarily for economic reason. So because of that, it may not really affect the investment issue. But apart from that, assuming there is a control over the court, the judiciary is not independent in Africa, you can as well insert what we call arbitration clause, where the place of arbitration may not be necessary in that particular country. You can take it out to London, to Singapore, to Paris, or to Dubai, where you can also secure your investment. If there's any breach, you can take it to arbitration before going to court. Where there is an award, you can also execute it. That's all just my contribution as a way of alerting the fears of those who want to invest in Africa. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you for that. And I think that's the first step, is the arbitration clauses and those kind of things, and that's utilized all over the world. The difficulty is, okay, We have a judgment. Now what? After we have a judgment, that becomes the thing, is what do we do after the judgment? It's not so much, I have to tell you, it's not so much, it's the execution of the judgment. And one of the things that we've talked to China about, and one of the things Africa can do, is to say, look, as a government, we don't need to get involved in, and look, it's very difficult and it could take a long time to change big political things. This is like it's the continent sort of moving in different markets and stuff, of changing things, and no one wants to think that they can control, especially being an American, politics overnight, or control politics, my goodness. But what the government can do is they can execute. They can execute, so a government, because they're in control of the police department, because they're in control of the sheriff's department, they can execute on judgments of infrastructure and control of things. And one of the things we've talked to China about, we've talked to other emerging markets about, is say, look, we'll invest, we'll do all of this. We'll have an arbitration clause in a place that we both agree to. Some countries, understandably don't want to go to America because we would be from America, or we would be, so we take a neutral place, okay? And that's totally understandable, and that happens. If you're from Texas or Louisiana, you have the same concern inside the United States of getting home cooked. Okay, so we choose an alternate thing. But one thing that the government can step up and do is to say, look, if we will pick certain places, arbitration venues, and we will commit that if one of our companies in our country breaches the contract and that judge says it, we'll execute the judgment. That's the most important thing. That's the problem that we have in China. It's like, my goodness, all the contracts, our investors don't want it locally. They want it in the venue in Singapore. They want it in the UK. They like the arbitration clauses. The problem is, okay, you sue somebody, they breach the contract. Now, how do you go get the money? How do you get control of the asset? How do you get control of the terminal or the house or the business? If the government steps in and the government says, I'm not changing the judiciary, I'm not making the decisions, but I'm going to recognize judgments. That's what the United States does well. If you have a judgment in a court, you can go to them, and the local executive branch, not the judiciary, the executive branch will go and knock on the person's door and say, I'm sorry you didn't pay your mortgage, and I'm sorry you have to leave. This house is no longer yours. And literally the sheriff's department comes and they do that. That type of security can be done. That doesn't take a total change of the mountains of stuff. It takes the executive branch to say, I'm going to recognize it, I'm going to execute it. And then on top of that, you have to have assets that are generally outside of the country, where there's an issue or assets placed in there of some type of security they can do. So.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, the hook is likely coming out soon to take us off stage, though we love the limelight and could talk about structured finance all day. But again, we're here for all of you. We've had experience in these markets. I've been delighted to hear your personal stories and your companies, and just really we have some incredible heavy hitters in the room. So, I like to also reframe the conversation a bit about is it you who need us, or is it us that need you? And I would prefer to almost say that really America needs partnering with all of you, and ensuring that your business models are taking off and achieving scale. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.